The Public Affairs Department of Kxo Radio provides recorded coverage of the Imperial Irrigation District Division II Candidates Forum, held via Zoom conference on the evening of October 1st, 2020. Coverage is underwritten by Colab of Imperial County and the IV Veg Growers. We take you now to our moderator, David Cañas.
The election for this seat is November 3rd, and we encourage you to vote. My name is David Cañas, and I will be the moderator for this evening. Since we're doing this remotely, we will use the app as a timekeeper and cell phone as the timer backup if we need it. Okay. I want to recognize, well, as a trade association, we make a concerted effort to educate our members and the public of the candidates for office in order to provide them with the best possible information with which to make a personal decision in this election process. Okay. I would like to recognize the candidates for office in attendance this afternoon in the order that their names will appear on the ballot. Mr. John Brooks Hamby and Mr. Ryan Childers. John, the format for this evening's forum is as follows. Each candidate will have 3 minutes for an opening statement to review their qualifications, thoughts, and major platform items. There will be 3 questions asked by myself, the moderator, pertaining to the issues of the contested elected office. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond. Questions submitted by the public at noon today will be asked, and you already know how many there are, as time permits at the end of the forum and prior to your closing statements. Questions that are deemed of a personal or as a personal attack or defamation, as well as those that contain obscene language, will not be asked. The question must be directly related to responsibilities of the IID Board of Directors or the experience of the candidate. Colab reserves to defer duplicate or redundant questions to ensure that the vast number of issues facing IID are addressed. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to rebut at any statement made other than by any other candidate after the question and answer time period is over. Again, personal attacks, defamation, or obscene language will not be permitted. If this occurs, we will ask Kxo to edit this portion of the forum. No changes to the forum will be made. Each candidate, again, will have 2 minutes for a closing statement. Candidates will be held to the allotted time periods, and we'll track that for you. The speaker will be muted once the time is expired, and we'll announce the time has expired, so you're aware. Starting the order will be based on the order drawn by the Imperial County Election Department of Ballots. Okay. So we'll get started here, and thank you. We will ask questions prepared by Colab. The time allotted for these questions, again, will be 2 minutes for each candidate. We will start based on the drawing drawn prior to the start of the forum for the order, and we'll proceed in that random order.
Opening comments. Opening comments.
Okay. So we'll start first with your opening comments, and we'll start with Mr. Hamby. 3 minutes, sir.
Wonderful. I just got a notification. Is this live on Facebook so the public can watch there?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, my name is JB Hamby. I'm a candidate for the Imperial Irrigation District Board of Directors, Division II. The IID is a really unique creature that we're blessed to have here in Imperial Valley that was created by a public vote nearly a century ago. And the issues at stake in this election are going to impact the Imperial Valley and what course we take over the next century and beyond. I just want to begin with a little bit of an overview of the issues here before the IID when it comes to water, power, and environmental issues that affect our economy and health as well. Starting off with water, we have perhaps the single most important issue, at least for me, is the direction we're going to take on the Colorado River. In the year 2026, a series of agreements expire that were drafted in 2007, and there is a significant effort across the entire Colorado River Basin to move water from primarily rural communities and move that water instead to burgeoning and sprawling desert cities like Denver, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas, essentially ending a way of life as we know it across the rural West. That cannot stand, and I believe it's important that the Imperial Irrigation District, much as we did in the last century, organize together along with those who have similar interests to our own to protect our water, keep it in our valley, and keep it in the places where it was designated for not marketed and monetized to other locations to advantage one set of communities at the expense of another. And as part of that, something that is so critical to me is a 2/3 public vote that would require any decision that would move water outside of Imperial Valley over and above these existing disastrous water transfers to require a 2/3 public vote of the people. This is a public resource, and the people themselves, who are the beneficiaries of this water, deserve to have the ultimate say whether any water leaves this valley, and I trust they will say no, which is why it's so important that we have a 2/3 vote. Additionally, we have this creeping disaster, if it was allowed to unfold here in Imperial Valley, which is the San Diego pipeline, which would permanently commit over 100 billion gallons of our water every year, sending it away to grow distant cities in the coastal plain of Southern California at the expense of the Imperial Valley, committing that water to further grow sprawling cities that have the means and can afford the ability to produce their own water, conserve, desalinate, reuse, and recycle, and instead want to pull that water out of our valley, disadvantaging us in the long term and leaving our communities with less options and less water at our disposal to continue the growth of our community. When it comes to power, we oppose raising power rates over the next 4 years, and that's so important, especially here in the age of COVID, when our community, specifically in Heber, El Centro, and Sealy, has been so devastated by the coronavirus that has impacted not only human health in our community, but has impacted our economy in a really devastating fashion as well. When it comes to the New River and the Salton Sea, 2026 is also so very critical. We can bang on the doors of legislators and try and, am I out of time here?
Mr. Childers,
Oh,
3 minutes, sir.
Okay, and if I may, or will we get some kind of notification when we're down to like 30 seconds or something? Because
yeah, I didn't receive a time Yeah, there's been no time notice. That would be helpful.
yeah, I agree. Mr. Kanyas, you're muted. We can't hear you.
So I will notify you when you have 20 seconds left and 10 seconds left.
Okay, thank you
We'll
very
keep
much.
that going through the questions.
Okay.
As soon as you're ready, sir.
Okay. My name is Ryan Childers, candidate for the IID Board of Directors for Division 2. And the reason that I decided to run for the IID Board of Directors is because, as we all know, the IID is one of our community's most important institutions. And the issues it faces are complex and of great importance to all of us. That's why it's critical that we elect leaders with the education and the values to effectively serve as leaders. I believe that my education as an accountant and my 16 years of experience as an attorney, in addition to my 12 years serving on El Centro school boards, makes me uniquely qualified to serve our community as an IID director. I was born and raised in Division 2, and I'm raising my family here as well. And I'm proud to say that our children, William and Abigail, are 5th generation Imperial Valley residents. And it's because of this that I have a vested interest in fighting for our valley and its future, and working to address the issues that matter most to all of us. The issues like preserving and protecting our water rights, keeping our power rates low and affordable, and restoring the Salton Sea, demanding action on the New River, and having the IID take its place as a center that can spur on and encourage economic development, bringing good jobs, good paying jobs to Imperial County. I will bring a fresh perspective and energetic leadership to the IID, and I will work to make it more efficient, effective, and better able to serve our community. Because the decisions that we make today not only affect us today, but they will have a lasting impact on our children and future generations. So thank you. And with that, I'm ready to move on to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. So let's start with the questions. Again, gentlemen, 2 minutes. And we'll begin with question number 1. Access to Colorado River water is the reason for the redevelopment of agriculture in Imperial Valley. While water rights are seemingly protected by the various laws of the river, the volume of water may be subject to reduction as the 2026 guidelines are negotiated if elected. If elected, what direction to staff would you support with other board members to protect the volume of water? And we'll start with Mr. Childers.
Thank you. And that's absolutely correct. In 2026, the interim guidelines on the river will be hopefully completed, as they're going out of date at that point. The negotiations for the 2026 a rewrite of the interim guidelines begins in 2021, which is next year. And so this is extremely important. The direction that I would give to staff would be twofold. Number one, there are a lot of assumptions that are based out of academic research about how the river is oversubscribed. And I think that we need to look at those with a critical eye, perhaps hire some of our own experts to make sure that those projections are right, because it's those projections that the outside forces, the other basin states, are going to use to leverage us into trying to give up water, which is something I oppose strongly. But in addition, I believe that there's this concept in the interim guidelines called intentionally created surplus, or ICS. And that is an important concept that we must maintain in the new rewrite of the 2026 guidelines. Because what it does is it allows us to take our water that's been conserved on our farms and store it, if we have storage, which is the other component that we have to walk away from these negotiations with. And that's adequate storage behind the Hoover Dam, and also the construction of other storage so that we can store water that we need for our own use here, and not have it go to LA or the Metropolitan Water District as it's currently doing when we underuse the water that we have allocated to us, or we overconserve. Either way, it ends up being a windfall for the people in LA and an unintentional water transfer. And the only way to stop those unintentional water transfers, thank you, is with the building of storage. And so I think those are the three main things that we need to walk away from as we renegotiate these interim guidelines. Of course, there's a lot of smaller details, but we're up on time.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Mr. Hamby, same question. Would you like me to repeat it, sir?
No, I've got it. So the 2026 issue is really one of the most critical issues to me, and this is what really guided me and made me commit to running for the Imperial Irrigation District. I've attended somewhere over 25 different conferences and listened to folks and twisting of information across the river. Ultimately, the attempt is trying to move water from rural communities like our own to continue and facilitate expansive sprawl in these larger, more populous areas. It's interesting because over 80% of the water on the Colorado River is primarily used and allocated for rural tribal communities. And it's so important that we form a coalition across the entire Colorado River Basin, much like the IID did in the 1920s and leading up to the Colorado River Compact and then ultimately the Boulder Canyon Project Act. We can't commit any water as part of this. I feel that is fundamentally wrong. The issue mainly here with the 2007 guidelines being reworked is you have Lakes Powell and Lake Mead that are under 50% capacity right now. You have a huge amount of air there and not water. And the great irony of this is we have the Imperial Irrigation District and also other places like Arizona who are not using their full entitlement on an annual basis. Since the QSA, IID is underrun somewhere around 1 million acre feet. But instead of us being able to bank that for our future use, that water is flowed for free to junior users. Similarly, in the state of Arizona, they are dumping over 4 million acre feet, I believe, of water into the desert to theoretically pull that up as groundwater later so that they wouldn't lose it to California and some of these other law of the river lore concerns. But ultimately, we need to keep that water behind Hoover Dam for our future use. I'm completely opposed to water marketing, leasing, and other things that would have less water in Imperial Valley and leave the Salton Sea high and dry. We need to stick to the compact.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. And we'll go on to question number 2, and we'll start with Mr. Hamby. And the question is, IID has 3 significant financial pressures that may necessitate a rate increase. The first is the COVID-19 situation with an average of 4,000 energy accounts, subject to a disconnect due to the non-payment. The second is current negotiations with the employees for the annual pay increase to include hazardous pay. The third is in negotiations for a 10-year contract for project labor agreement, which is projected based on various prior PLA experience, could increase IID costs anywhere from 8 to 20%. Are you in support of a rate increase for any of these 3 items? If so, which one is the most important for the viability and economic development of Imperial County residents? Mr. Hamby.
Absolutely. And to answer your question about support of a rate increase, not at all. We made a commitment starting in the very beginning of this campaign that I would oppose any and all efforts to raise power rates over the next 4 years. It's my personal belief that IID needs to tighten its belt before the community is asked to tighten theirs. We're hurting as a community right now. There are families who can't afford to pay their bills right now. I know my barber at least is working 18+ hour days commuting between Imperial and San Diego so he can try and keep his lights on in his business that was closed for a significant period of time. So it doesn't make sense to raise power bills at a time when our community is hurting most. That's just simply not appropriate. There are funds available when it comes to the COVID disruptions to IID's revenues, and we need to spend through that. And historically, they have not. And then we can replenish those once we're able to recover from the virus. When it comes to the project labor agreement, there is not a lot of reliable information because you have two different sides that say two totally different opposite things. I haven't been able to look at the books or devote the time I'd like as of yet to as needed. But my ultimate purpose on that issue is we need to hire locally. That is the most important thing to any agreement. And I would only sign on to something when it comes to that would hire locally. But under no circumstance, if it was found that there was going to create additional rate pressure, would I support such a thing. Those are all things that need to be looked at, different things in different places. But the most important thing for me is that I'm elected by the people of Imperial Valley. We're in a time where people cannot afford a rate increase right now. We've committed over the next 4 years to searching for efficiency before we start searching around in people's wallets.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. Same question for Mr. Childers. Would you like me to repeat it, sir?
If you could, please. Thank you.
The question was, IID has three significant financial pressures that may necessitate a rate increase. The first is a COVID-19 situation with an average of 4,000 energy accounts, subject to a disconnect due to non-payment. The second is current negotiations with the employees for the annual pay increase to include hazardous pay. The third is the in negotiation 10-year contract for project labor agreement, which is projected based on various prior PLA experience, could increase IID costs anywhere from 8 to 20%. Are you in support of rate increases for any of these three items? If so, which one is the most important for the viability and economic development of Imperial County residents? 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you. No, I do not support the idea of rate increases. But that's not to say that some of the things that you've listed are not items that we can come through and still do right, for instance, by our employees, our IID employees, and recognize the hard work that they do and the very trying circumstances under which they've been working. But having said that, I think it's important that we elect leaders who are able to look at the books, analyze the books, and understand the books themselves without the need to just rely on staff. And so let me point out some things that I've taken note of. First of all, in the rate stabilization account, we have $66 million sitting on the balance sheet. That money just sits there. It does not appear to have been spent for any length of time, and it's there for the purpose of stabilizing rates. And so before I would even consider a discussion of rate increases, that account would have to be spent down. After all, that's what it's for. Second of all, with respect to the COVID-19 pressures that are being placed on the IID's budget, let me first say that I support the IID's decision not to turn off people's electricity during this pandemic. And I think that what we are seeing currently is the good folks in our call centers at the IID are working hard to call people who are behind and saying, you know, we understand you may not be able to catch up entirely, but if you can pay anything, it'll help the IID, it'll help the rest of the community. And we've seen those collections go up. And so the projections were initially about $12 million budget shortfall because of COVID. I saw those projections go as high as 16. And now in recent IID meetings, we're seeing those go down. As a result, the IID's cash position has actually gone up $12 million during this time. So again, if we understand our budgets, we realize the money's there to weather this storm and give our employees the pay increase they deserve and do it without raising rates.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Our next question. Last week, for the first time in 23 years, The U.S. Congress held what was to be a bipartisan hearing on the Salton Sea. As you are aware, the U.S. federal government owns nearly half of the largest portion of the land at the Salton Sea. Please provide your comments on that hearing, and what you would do to increase the support from the U.S. federal government. And we'll start with Mr. Childers, sir, 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you. That hearing was interesting, to say the least, to see the divergence of opinions of some members on the committee. It was nice to see Secretary Crowfoot and some of the other individuals there to testify and make this issue known to Congress, the issue of the massive environmental disaster that is occurring right under our noses here at the Salton Sea, affecting our community day in and day out. But one congressman actually suggested, well, why don't we just dry the lake up? Which luckily some of the other speakers pushed back against. But that is the attitude from some people outside of Imperial County. But there's no question that even though the state has committed approximately $345 million over the years to addressing the issues at the Salton Sea, that if we're going to be able to do what we need to do, it's going to require assistance from the federal government. Studies have shown that it could take as much as $9 billion to fully restore the Salton Sea. And so again, we're going to need the federal government to step in and help us. And the Secretary of Interior, in their budget for 2021, actually noted that they believe the federal government was legally obligated for dust mitigation projects to the tune of about $330 million. So that's an admission from the Interior Department. I think it's far too little, but it's at least an admission that they have some obligation to be assisting the state and the local agencies as we try and address this issue at the Salton Sea.
Thank you, sir. That concludes. Oh, I'm sorry, I almost forgot you, Mr. Hamby. Same question, sir.
Oh,
2
you
minutes.
can't forget me.
Would you like to repeat the question?
No, I got it. Thanks. Yeah, some of the most delightful comments I heard there was from Mr. McClintock, who made the comment that masks for COVID certainly don't work, but for COVID, but they definitely work for those people down in Imperial Valley who we should just dry up the Salton Sea and that'll work. They'll just wear dust masks in the future, and that's just a quality of life that Americans should enjoy. That was an interesting and really repulsive sort of comment from Mr. McClintock, but he also made a really good statement, which was surprising and maybe redeeming in some small way, which was, he asked, well, why are you guys here? It's been 17 years since you agreed to the QSA, which he interestingly called a quid pro quo. I thought that was an interesting statement, in which water was pledged to the coast, and in exchange, the state of California assumed liability at the Salton Sea. And no doubt, while the federal government has half of the acreage underneath the Salton Sea when it comes to the BLM ownership of those lands, you and Torres Martinez with the trust responsibility for the tribes, the interesting thing is that the state is ultimately responsible for this. And right now we have 40 square miles that are exposed of dried up lake bed at the Salton Sea. And if you go out there on any windy day with the winds blowing out of the west, you'll be sandblasted at Red Hill Bay. It's a horrific sort of experience, but more we're going to look forward to with a complete lack of action whatsoever, because ultimately the interest was never protecting the health and safety of those people in Imperial County and the health of the environment at the Salton Sea. The interest was always securing water for the coast of Southern California. So as we move forward to 2026, the first thing we can do is add no new harm to the situation, which is we cannot commit any more water outside of Imperial Valley through any scheme whatsoever that would result in less water in Imperial Valley and less water in the Salton Sea. So, and as part of that, I'm proud to say that I'm the only candidate in this race that has any experience whatsoever in DC as a page, and also other experience there. And I look forward to using that for the benefit of the Valley and the Salton Sea in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. That concludes the 3 questions that we had from Colab. We're now going to start the questions that came from the audience. They will be held, you will all be held to 2 minutes on those answers. So starting with the first one, some developers would like IID to pay for all or part of new substations. What is the impact to IID's bottom line and our power bills? And we'll start with Mr. Hamby on that one.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a good question. So ultimately, the IID's position right now which not saying it's perfect, but I think it's in the right place, is that if you want to add new development, you want to add new growth, you need to pay for it. Unfortunately, there are some developers who want to essentially socialize the costs and privatize the gains of having built new substations in the Imperial and Coachella valleys, having us pay for it as ratepayers while they're the ones that profit and enjoy a very good life and many zeros in their annual income. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's fair. I think the IID's policy as of right now is in a pretty good spot. Can we firm it up or make things a little bit easier to deal with and replicate a little bit of how city impact fees work? Ultimately, an impact is being made and an expense is being incurred on the part of the public, perhaps. But ultimately, those who are profiting are the ones who need to pay, not ratepayers.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. Mr. Childers, same question. Would you like me to repeat it, sir?
No, I think I have the question. You know, what's interesting about what Mr. Hamby's saying is he's essentially advocating for a chokehold on economic development. See, as things stand right now, the number of substations that we have in Imperial County, not Coachella, in Imperial County, are inadequate for projects that are wanting to come online, projects that will create jobs. There was a new industry that was looking to relocate into Calexico, and most of those folks who were looking to do that have pulled out because they were being told that they had to spend between $8 and $12 million to fund a substation that would ultimately benefit other users who would come later. There was an experience not too far in the distant past in Imperial, where a doctor's office was coming in to build a new doctor's office, and initially was told they may have to pay to build a new substation, $8 to $12 million. Luckily, that issue was resolved. But if you tell people that are going to come in and be customers of the IID, buying power from the IID, that they have to build the IID's infrastructure, especially when in the past, that has never been the position of the IID. And so we have to, as an IID board, we have to make sure that infrastructure is adequately funded in our budgets. And we need to do it so that as our community grows, the IID can pay for the infrastructure. Again, the IID is the one who sells the power. And so the IID should be the one responsible for placing the infrastructure in place to provide for future economic development. When you ask a developer who says he's going to build 10 apartments, 12 apartments, something like that, and they need a new substation, you're going to tell them they need to spend $12 million on a substation that, again, they're not going to use the full capacity. Others will be the beneficiaries of the money that they spent. Now, that's not to say that there aren't ways that we can structure that would alleviate some of those issues, but I think just telling developers that you're going to have to pay $8 to $12 million will kill economic development and kill jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Our next question, gentlemen. You both enjoy support within the agricultural community. Mr. Hamby, you are supported by John Hawk and members of the Abadi family. Mr. Childers, J.P. Laboucherie and former IID Director Steve Benson are supporting you. My question to both of you is, in light of the appellate ruling in the Abadi lawsuit against IID, which found that IID holds the Imperial Valley's water rights for the beneficial interest of all of its water users, what is your position on this appellate ruling, and will you defend this public resource if you're elected to the IID? We'll start with Mr. Childers, sir. 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'd like to say that I'm proud of the broad-based community support I've had through donations to my campaign. We have almost 100 individual donors that have donated to our campaign, and you're absolutely right. Among those individuals is my lifelong friend, a man whose wedding I was in, a man who was in my wedding, and that's J.P. Laboucherie. Mr. Benson has also become a good friend of mine, and I believe, and they know, that there's nothing about them donating to my campaign that would ever cause me to change a core belief. That is just not in who I am. I am here to represent the Imperial Valley, not take up for the interests of a few. And so now with respect to the IID lawsuit, I do believe that the opinion that was drafted by the 4th District Court of Appeals was a well-reasoned, well-thought-out, well-written opinion that is a very good representation of what the law of the river and water law is in California. And so I think it's important that the IID, if the Supreme Court decides to hear it, that they continue to defend this lawsuit vigorously until it's concluded in a manner that is consistent with what the 4th District Court of Appeals has found. And we need to understand that the IID holds water rights in trust for the benefit of all the people in Imperial County. That includes people that live in apartments, that includes people that run businesses, and yes, it includes agriculture. The good news is also that despite the fact that there's been a water transfer, that our farmers have gotten very good at conserving water, and they continue to farm every acre of ground that farmers want to farm. And when they ask for water, regardless of the amount, they get it. And I think that's something with good leadership we can continue as long as we continue to vigorously defend our water rights and make sure that no more water goes out of the valley.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Mr. Hamby, same question. Would you like me to repeat it, sir?
No, I got it. And I wanted to challenge one bit of your question there because it has embedded in it some false information. I haven't received any contributions financially or any other way from the second set of individuals you mentioned there. That's a great bit of disinformation that people enjoy trying to spread. But if that's a contribution that's out there, it's not one I've received, certainly not one I've cashed, at least so far I've seen. And if you want to send a contribution in, you can go to jbhamby.iid.com. But so to answer your question there about the suit in the appellate court, the issue we have there is twofold. Is number one, why is the equitable distribution plan equitable? And second was a larger question about water rights in Imperial Valley. When it came to the equitable distribution plan and whether it was equitable, the court found that it ultimately was not, as it had one class of water users take the entire hit of a shortage and not so with any other class of water users, which by default and by many people's admission was by its very essence not equitable. When it came to this larger issue of water rights, the court made what I believe to be the correct decision. That's not agreed with by many individuals in some parts of the ag community. But I thought the decision was well considered and well done, and it stated as fact much of what's been true so long or so far as the entire history of the Imperial Valley is concerned, which is that the Imperial Irrigation District has a contract to divert water from the Colorado River and deliver it for use in the Imperial Valley, and that water users in the Imperial Valley have a right to service, which is not any specific number. There are no individual water rights in Imperial Valley. It is a right to be served as much water as you need, so long as that use is reasonable and beneficial, which makes it so much, so special, I should say, and so very secure, especially in contrast to other places within California where there's a different water rights situation, or in Arizona where you have contracts apportioned to individual pieces of land where the water could be separated away from the land, as we're seeing in Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. Our next question. Are there any monetary or in-kind donations that are newer and yet to be reported? We'll start with Mr. Hamby. 2 minutes, sir.
No, my 460s are updated. I hope people will send in contributions, small as possible, as little as $5 to jbhamby.iid.com. But as of the 460s that were filed last week, I don't think we've received any new contributions. You need to check my mailbox, though.
Yeah. Mr. Childers, same question. Would you like me to repeat it, sir?
Yeah, if you could, please.
Are there any monetary or in-kind donations that are newer and yet to be reported?
No, the answer to that question is no. All of the contributions that I've received were reported on our last filing, which I believe was filed September 24th. And I do not believe I've received any contributions since then. If I have, we're very diligent about reporting those as quickly as 24 hours if they're over $1,000. And so those would have been reported within the day they were received. So everything should be up to date and reported, including in-kind contributions. Trying to be as transparent as we can be on those issues.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Our next question. How do you propose to maintain low energy rates and upgrade failing energy infrastructure in Imperial Valley? Mr. Childers.
Well, I think this goes back to the question that was asked earlier in many ways about whether or not developers should bear the brunt of building substations. But the simple fact of the matter is that we do have to invest and infrastructure upgrades on both sides, water and power, but most specifically on the power side, because for those that tuned in to the discussion in Congress about the Salton Sea, one of the topics was geothermal development. And I believe geothermal is going to be an important partner in addressing issues at the Salton Sea. Control Thermal Resources is a geothermal plant that will be out there by the Hell's Kitchen area of the Salton Sea. They're going to be building in 7 phases, each phase covering 200 acres of exposed playa. So that one project will cover 1,400 acres of exposed playa. But in order to be able to get the energy that's being produced out to where it's needed, some of it will be used in the IID, but a lot of it will be sold to other areas as renewable energy. We're going to have the critical infrastructure necessary to export that power where it needs to be used. And that's true of future geothermal development as well. So it's important that we make these investments into the infrastructure so that we can reap the returns in economic benefit and good paying jobs. It's just part of what directors do in terms of how they allocate resources, deciding what parts of the budget are the most important. And I would put investment in things that are going to return good paying jobs right at the very top of the list.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Mr. Hamby, same question. Would you like me to repeat it, sir?
I'm all right. Thank you, though. I did want to, since this is an energy question, kind of discuss a little bit that was mentioned in a previous thing. I don't believe that the chokehold on economic development in Imperial Valley is not giving handouts to developers. The real chokehold on economic development in Imperial Valley is removing disposable income from people's pockets when we hand out free $10, $12 million pieces of infrastructure that in the main, especially when it comes to new development, benefits very few. When it comes to infill and that sort of a thing, that's a wise thing to do, and we can work with that. But ultimately, that sort of activity is only going to raise our rates and commit new revenue or create new costs that are ultimately going to be borne by ratepayers. And that's a good question also about upgrading infrastructure in a broader sense. A lot of our system was built out in the 1970s or so, and those who built it did a very good job, and it's lasted to this day. But it really does need to be maintained and improved, a lot of it, and it requires funds to do so. But I think what's important about this, before we just broadly raise rates on everybody, and this is why I make this 4-year statement about raising power rates, or not raising power rates, I should say, a 4-year commitment not to raise power rates over the next 4 years, as I believe that we need to commit to efficiency and do a full review and study about where we're spending, what's efficient, what's not, what's working, what's not working. And once we've completed that review, which will probably take about 4 years, we can make a much larger set of decisions about the next 25, 50 years of upgrading and maintaining our system. I think it's important that we do our homework before we just raise people's power bills.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. Our next question, gentlemen. What is your view of the proposed San Diego pipeline? If built, what are the benefits or consequences for Imperial Valley? We'll start with Mr. Hamby. 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you. That's a really good question. A couple of things. Well, first of all, the Salton Sea pipeline, in my belief, is going to be a disaster for the Imperial Valley and leave us in a situation that removes options for keeping our water here for future generations. Essentially, what the San Diego pipeline does is takes 100 billion gallons of water every year that's right now going to San Diego and building a duplicative, unnecessary second pipeline directly to San Diego. The consequences of that are several-fold. First of all, what we can see is that there's a clear commitment on the part of San Diego to try and lower our rates, but there's no commitment whatsoever to spending billions of dollars on the Salton Sea. They'll build a $5 billion+ pipeline to make sure that La Jolla and Del Mar and Encinitas have lower water rates, but will not similarly commit or even admit that the disaster we're seeing unfolding at the Salton Sea is a water quantity problem, with water not entering Imperial Valley, not being used here, and not ending up in the Salton Sea. Secondly, it creates a huge set of issues when it comes to the long term, and especially in the case of shortages on the Colorado River. If there is a shortage, San Diego being a more junior user, if there is to be a cut in San Diego, they're not going to run an empty pipeline and just shrug their shoulders and be okay with it. They're going to be looking for additional supply, and whether they have hat and cash in hand, or they're going to try and pressure and intimidate, as is the storied history in Western water, I don't think that's going to open us up and put us in a better position. We don't need to sacrifice ourselves and our future and the future growth and development of Imperial Valley, also that we can ensure that San Diego has lower rates. We already have people in our valley in Calapat and Nyland who are paying higher rates than San Diego is. And that's just patently unfair. Without water, the desert is a grave, and that's exactly where the pipe is going to take us.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. Mr. Childers, same question. Would you like me to repeat it, sir?
Yes, if you could.
What is your view of the proposed San Diego pipeline? If built, what are the benefits or consequences for Imperial Valley? 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Yes, I think this is a really important question. For those of you that were able to read the Imperial Valley Press today, the editorial page, they'll see that Mr. Brian McNeese, who has been a very forward thinker and very eloquent speaker on behalf of maintaining our water rights here in Imperial County, pointed out and took issue with some of the rhetoric that Mr. Hamby has been using lately around this issue of the pipeline, or more, as it's more accurately described, an aqueduct. And my concern is that what we're seeing is nothing more than fear mongering. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that I'm favoring this pipeline, but what people need to know is, unlike the video that Mr. Hamby posted that made it sound like this was something that was going to be built soon and that was going to start sucking billions of gallons of water out of the valley, none of that is true. The only thing that's true is there's a consideration to study, a second phase of a study about whether or not this aqueduct or pipeline should be built in the year 2048. And only then it would have to be approved by an IID board that would be 4 or 5 terms from now, not one that Mr. Hamby or I, if either one of us are elected, are likely to be there to vote on. And again, this is just to study the issue. So I don't know how someone who is being thoughtful about this issue can say they're for or against it without seeing what the return on the study is. Are there possible benefits for Imperial County? If they agreed to build a pipeline whose capacity could never exceed what they currently have in a contract in the QSA in terms of a water transfer, might that be something that we could use to get storage? These are questions I don't know the answer to. Why I can't say whether or not I support this pipeline, but I can say that I do believe in being thoughtful, not trying to scare people for votes, and letting another phase of the study go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. John, we'll go to the next question. As an IID director, one of the responsibilities is to represent IID on other boards and various committees. The majority of those meetings are outside of the Imperial Valley. Is there any reason that you would be unable to travel outside to the Imperial Valley to participate in those meetings? And do you have any time constraints that would preclude you from having a 60-hour week on occasion? We'll start with Mr. Childers. 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Let me be very clear. Before I decided to undertake this endeavor and run for the IID Board of Directors, I sat down with my family and made them aware of what the anticipated impacts would be in terms of my schedule. And so I can say without any equivocation at all that I will be able to attend any and every meeting necessary. Mr. Hamby wrongfully stated earlier that he's the only candidate that has any experience in Washington, D.C., and he served as a page, which is an admirable thing for Senator Ben Sasse. But that's very different than going there as an elected leader and lobbying your congressman, which is something I've been involved in as a school board member. I've traveled to Sacramento and talked to our state lawmakers on issues that affect local schools. So that's not experience that Mr. Hamby can claim that's exclusive to him. But beyond that, I have taken steps to drastically change my law practice to make me available to serve as an IID director. I have cut down the number of practice areas that we engage in to just 3 practice areas. I have pared back on staff so that we have a lighter footprint. And not only that, I've made sure in my early years in business to invest and save so that I can afford what is going to be a substantial cut to my income in order to serve in this capacity. But I'm not saying that because I want sympathy. I'm proud and happy to be able to do it. But this question of whether or not I'm going to have the time, I wouldn't be in this race if I didn't think I had the time. The issues are far too important. And as I said in my opening statement, I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing it because I know what we're going to decide and do will affect future generations. And I wouldn't risk that if I thought I didn't have the time to do the job.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Mr. Hamby, the same question. Would you like me to repeat it, sir?
No, I got it. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I'm unique in the sense that I've already been doing this across the Colorado River, attending meetings, creating partnerships, getting to know people, and building a network across the Colorado River Basin that I'm looking forward to putting together and implementing what I've already done over the past several years into place on day one as an IID director. That coalition that I mentioned, moving forward to 2026, with rural communities, agricultural communities, senior water right holders, tribes, and environmentalists, those who have not been bought out by various interests that are trying to move water into larger suburban areas. That's what I've already been working on. I've traveled across the Colorado River a number of times, attended over 25 different conferences, and I'm really proud to have built that network. And I think I'm uniquely qualified in that sense to be ready on day one. The other thing, since I have a little bit of time, is to demonstrate how dangerous this pipeline is. This is a door that we should not open. We could study how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but what this pipeline is committing Imperial Valley to a future with less water. This is perhaps the single greatest issue that is going to cause negative impact to the Imperial Valley. The transfers have already been devastating enough to the Salton Sea. This pipeline, if implemented, will commit us to a future in which that water is not being used in Imperial Valley for our community's benefit. It's going to be going to San Diego. We should not investigate the pipe. We should not move forward with the pipe. We should not consider the pipe. The pipe is going to be a disaster for this valley, and we cannot allow it to proceed. That's not a door we should allow to open. And that's just period on the end of that sentence, or exclamation point maybe.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. Mr. Childers, same question, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm asking again. Our next question, gentlemen. Yeah. The take-home pay of a Group 8 equipment operator under the current prevailing wage rules for IID projects would be $42,000 less per year per full-time employee under a project labor agreement, the PLA. Do you support this amount of money leaving Imperial County, and is it already depressed our economy? Mr. Hamby.
Yeah, I don't know if that the backing of that question is accurate or not. So I can't make a statement as to whether or not the premise of the question is true or the information in there is accurate. But what I will say is that whatever is in the works, and it's been over a year at this point that the IID has been working on a project labor agreement. Ultimately, what comes together, whatever surfaces eventually out of closed session, what has to be done is ensure that jobs are local, that they hire local, and that's in many ways what some of the priorities of PLA are. But not all PLAs are created equal, and it's important that we see exactly what's in the black and white. So I can't quite answer that question because I don't know if the information is accurate or not.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. Mr. Childers, same question. Would you like me to repeat it, sir?
No, that's okay. I think I understand it. I have seen the information that says that $42,000 would be essentially lost to the valley. Again, I haven't seen the underlying study. I don't know exactly how that figure was derived at, but I will say this. I support money that the IID spends, whether it be on projects or otherwise, staying in the Imperial Valley to the extent possible. I'd like to see it be 100% if it were possible. That's not always possible because sometimes we have contractors that are specialized that come in from outside the area. But the IID to have maximum impact when it comes to economic development is going to be amplified when that money is spent through local companies, local workers, local vendors, because then they spend that money on their workers go out and spend with other businesses, and so on and so forth. So it's absolutely vital that the IID understands its role in that sense and also understands its role in helping these businesses create local jobs. With respect to the PLA, there's a lot of information that we still don't know. As we all know, the devil is in the details. And when that's going to come out, then we'll all be privy to see what those details are. But I think that there is a path forward. with respect to maintaining local business and its ability to work with the IID, but also recognizing the concerns of labor. It's a matter, though, of sitting down and bringing people of goodwill together and trying to address the various concerns of the different stakeholders. And so as an IID board member, that would always be my first priority, is to get stakeholders together, try not to spring things on people, try and talk out differences, and hopefully we can start to bring down some of these litigation costs that we've seen be so exorbitant because of what I believe is a fundamental lack of communication between all the stakeholders and getting different points of view.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Gentlemen, our next question. Do you support the public having a say over future water transfers? If the water is a public resource, why shouldn't the public have a say? We'll start with Mr. Childers, sir. 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you. So I do have some concerns about, I assume you're referring to Mr. Hamby's pledge to have a 2/3 vote on any water transfers out of the valley. My concern is, number one, we have an elected IID board for a reason. We are a representative democracy, not a direct democracy. But my real concern lies beyond that. Mr. Hamby said in our last debate that when it came to water, that we should not allow money and influence that comes from money to interfere with our decisions as it relates to water and potential water transfers. My concern is, as we all know, and it's sad, but it's true, that money is an outsized influence on any election. And so who has the most money and the most resources to potentially affect an election over our water rights? Well, it's of course the wealthy landowners, and not all of them by any stretch support more water transfers, but some do. And of course the water interests themselves, the hedge funds, MWD, which is LA's water district, would have a substantial amount of resources to come down here and commit in trying to influence an election over the issue of a water transfer. And I don't think it's wise to open ourselves up to that kind of situation. Beyond that, it would disenfranchise a number of voters in our county. Not every voter in our county is allowed to vote in an IID race because they don't all live in the IID service area, but they would certainly be impacted by the effects of a water transfer. So I don't support disenfranchising local voters. It's just not something that we should be doing. Lastly, in Mr. Abadi's op-ed of recent, he repeated 4 or 5 times that he thought the IID board of directors had too much influence over our water. What Mr. Hamby is espousing, whether he knows it or not, is exactly what Mr. Abadi is calling for, which is to take power away from the IID board, who is elected to become experts on these issues and protect our water rights, and I will not support that.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Mr. Hamby, same question. Would you like me to repeat it, sir?
Yeah, I know I got it. And talk about fear mongering and spreading of disinformation. Look at that. That's an amazing thing. You know, ultimately, at the end of the day, I trust the 30,000 voters of Imperial Valley who vote in Imperial Irrigation District elections and who vote and live here. I trust them more than 3 people now or in the future on the IID board. I don't think that's fair to myself or anybody should be elected on the IID board to have the entire weight of the future of the Valley placed in your one vote. And so I think Mr. Childers fundamentally does not understand the 2/3 concept, which is to say that only the people of Imperial Valley, of whom the water belongs to them together as a community, only they should be allowed to give direction to the IID board to untie their hands to facilitate a future water transfer. So if there's an interest in selling more water to San Diego or to sell more water to Los Angeles or any other place, the worst thing you could do is have a 2/3 public vote. If you want to keep our water here, we need to have a 2/3 public vote. If we believe in the people and we believe in democracy and we believe that this is a public resource owned by the people of Imperial Valley, they need to have the ultimate say over any water staying or leaving. And I've spent a lot of time constructing that language on the 2/3 public vote. It is an amazing thing that will benefit this valley in the long term. IID has a wonderful and storied history of public votes, and not to have a public vote on the most important question is just plain wrong. We had a public vote to form the IID in 1911. We had a public vote in 1919 on the All-American Canal contract. We had the IID board in 1985 require a public vote through an IID resolution that was unfortunately turned over in the very next year by a pro-transfer board. So if we want to keep our water here, you need to make that decision as voters, not me or Mr. Childers.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. Our next question. The International Boundaries and Water Commission seemingly has ignored the growing crisis at the New River. If elected, how would you envision a change to this focus for the commission? We'll start with Mr. Hamby.
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
The International Boundaries and Water Commission seemingly has ignored the growing crisis at the New River. If elected, how would you envision a change to this focus for the commission? 2 minutes, sir.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Jane Harkin, who's now the commissioner of the International Boundary and Water Commission, which is the federal commission that oversees the 1944 treaty between the United States and Mexico and water issues that transcend the U.S.-Mexico international border, primarily in the Colorado River and the Rio Grande, also, but some other smaller streams like the New River. Ultimately, what Jane Harkin made very clear at her last appearance, which was disappointing in many ways, before the public in Calexico, was she said, ultimately, if you want to have action at the New River, I can't do anything about it, which I think is problematic in a number of ways. But the other thing she said is, if you want action, you got to get this before Congress. And ultimately, what's happening in 2026 on the Colorado River, I believe, should not be what the urban agencies want it to be, which is simply a water quantity issue to assure that they don't get shortage cuts. I believe that the 2026 Colorado River discussions need to include the New River and the Salton Sea. That agreement to be signed by December 31st, 2025 or so, that ultimately gets ratified by Congress. And that agreement is where we can achieve a wastewater treatment facility in the United States in Calexico. And this is not an unreasonable thing to have a water treatment plant to ensure that Imperial Valley residents enjoy the same protections under the Clean Water Act as everybody else. In the 1970s, 1980s era, our water quality we were sending down to Mexico as part of their entitlement and treaty obligation was so salty it was violating the federal or the international treaty between the US and Mexico. And a water desalination facility was actually built in Yuma to ensure that Mexico's deliveries of water that they were receiving were not so salty that they were unsuitable for purposes of use in the Mexicali Valley. So in this context, it is entirely reasonable, and we should include that as a part of this larger Colorado River discussion, because the New River is a distributary of the Colorado, to ensure that we have a wastewater treatment facility in the United States in Calexico that will ensure we enjoy the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act just as much as everybody else.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. Mr. Childers, same question. Would you like me to repeat it, sir?
Yes, please.
The International Boundaries and Water Commission seemingly has ignored the growing crisis at the New River. If elected, how would you envision a change to this focus for the commission?
Yes, so I was actually in attendance when the U.S. commissioner for the IWBC was in Calexico. And I viewed her comments slightly differently than Mr. Hamby did. I don't believe that she said she couldn't do anything. And I do agree that it was a disheartening meeting. A lot of frustration was expressed by our community, as it should have been. What she did say, though, was that building a wastewater treatment plant on the U.S. side of the border isn't a problem. The money's there to do it. They've done it in many other places. What she said was the issue was where we were going to come up with the operations and maintenance budget. She said that was the real issue. And so what we've seen, though, since she was here is that $550 million allocated by NADBank to go to border infrastructure pollution projects. We saw another $300 million in the renegotiation of NAFTA, the United States, Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement or trade agreement that is specifically set aside to deal with border pollution issues. And so I think the money is finally there for us to bring this solution to fruition, the only real solution, which is the construction of a wastewater treatment plant on the U.S. side of the border. A 2016 study by the EPA indicated that to bring Mexicali's infrastructure up to speed in order to treat the sewage that was going into the new river would cost $80 million. And that old definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. For us to spend that kind of money in Mexico again would be the very definition of insanity. We have to control the process and the project. And I think that if we have leaders who understand what it takes to go to Washington and engage with our elected officials, that the money is there to cover not just the construction, but the operations and maintenance, and it will create good jobs and clean this water to Clean Water Act standards for the first time in 75 years. It's been too long. The time is now.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, this concludes our public questions that we had. We're now going to allow our candidates 2 minutes to rebut any of the questions or items that have come up. And we'll start with Mr. Childers. 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Yes. And so this idea that because I'm pointing out that large elections, important elections, are often influenced in an outsized way by money, opens us up to that outside influence and the influence of money on an election over our water. It's not fear-mongering. It's stating a reality. And to point out that Mr. Abadi, in his own editorial, 4 or 5 times, suggested that the IID's board had too much power when it came to making decisions about our water. So stripping the IID board, who is elected by the voters, who is accountable to the voters for their decisions, of the power to make the decisions they've traditionally had the power to make with respect to our water, that does not serve the community's interest. It opens us up to outside influence and outside interests. And so again, that is not fear-mongering. I would also say that with respect to, if I could just have a second here, I made some notes, that investing, the IID investing as is its charge in infrastructure so that development can happen is not a handout to developers. It's what the IID has always done. It's what they have traditionally done until recently. And when you ask a doctor building a $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 doctor's office to pay for a $12 million substation, that's just incoherent policy. The IID and eventually the cost of infrastructure will come down the more ratepayers we add to our system, because the cost of that infrastructure is distributed more widely. But if we choke off the ability to bring in more accounts, more ratepayers, because we're asking for something that only the biggest developers could possibly pay for, then we're only making matters worse for ourselves, because our infrastructure is aging and the number of people that can help pay for it, it is less and less and less. And that's just not something that's workable. So again, I would push back on that.
20 seconds, sir.
20 seconds. Okay, well, if there's only 20 seconds, then I'll leave it at those 2 points.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Mr. Hamby, 2 minutes to rebut, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the point that is completely missed in the attempt to throw mud at a perfectly good idea, which is intent is to put the power directly in the people's hands. The point that is completely missed is the idea of 2/3. The idea that in order to facilitate the movement of more water out of Imperial Valley to go other places in a way that would hurt the Salton Sea, the only way that that could be done under this proposal is to get 2/3 of the people of Imperial Valley to consent to that, to say it's such a good idea. Right now, all it takes is 3 people on an IID board. And that's not making any statements about this board in particular. What I'm really referencing is the board of 2003, where it took 3 people to commit us to a 110-year water transfer. That agreement signed in 2003 will be around long after I'm dead. I get some heat thrown at me and some mud thrown at me because I'm a young man. But what I also have is a long-term view. And what I'm certainly not going to do is commit Imperial Valley to agreements to sending away our most precious resource to other wealthier communities until long after even I'm dead. That is insane. It's crazy. We should only trust the people over this most important decision. And the idea that the people will be duped, that's just plain wrong. I trust the people. I trust them with their vote. I believe that they should have the ultimate say over any water leaving the Imperial Valley. And to say otherwise just does not trust the people of Imperial Valley, and it does not respect the voters. When it comes to this other idea also about the substations, if you want to pay higher bills for your power bills in the summer, like this summer when it was 122 degrees, if you want to pay a higher power bill, don't vote for me. I'm the wrong candidate. If you want to ensure that a few people are able to afford another race car or another home on the coast, certainly you should not vote for me, because I'm not going to be giving away stuff for free from your wallet to ensure that other people have a better quality of life than you do. My primary concern is the average person of Imperial Valley who sees that these water transfers have been so destructive to this valley and don't want their wallet picked just to make somebody else's larger.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. That concludes the rebuttal section. We're now going to go to our final section, and that will be our closing statements. And we'll start with Mr. Hamby. 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I guess what I want to touch on here is this has been a very long and very interesting campaign. It's historic in a number of ways, and it'll certainly be a very unusual event should I be elected this next month in front one put to the ballot next week in front of the people of Heber, El Centro, and Sealy. And I'm really humbled and honored to have earned the support of the majority or the plurality of the people of Division 2 in this race. And I think what we bring with us in this campaign is a long-term vision to protect our most valuable resource, which is our water, and ensure that it's put to use in Imperial Valley, that it's not sent elsewhere, that we're not going to have a future in which we have less of a resource to live with, less of a resource so that other places can be made wealthier and healthier while we're made poorer and drier and less prosperous as a result. And so all of this gets summed up really in this statement, water is life. And I've heard that or was really inspired by some communities, some tribal communities on the Colorado River, but also the Acequias of New Mexico. These are small people, they're not big farmers. They live in northern New Mexico, and they've been there for hundreds of years, and they've irrigated with the small amount of water that they have to grow beans and corn and other small things, and they have a quality of life as a result of their water, the little that they have. And here in Imperial Valley, the entire history of this place is made possible because of this resource. And when you give it away, you can't get it back. That's why we're so passionate about the 2/3 public vote. That's why we are so passionate about keeping our water here, because the quality of life and the future opportunity in Imperial Valley is so diminished when that water is given away. This is a public resource. It belongs to you, and it belongs here. We need to keep it here for our future. We cannot afford to give it away. We also can't afford in the time of COVID to raise our power bills. And that's my commitment, not only during this time of COVID as the pandemic continues, but over the next 4 years and committing to efficiency before we commit to picking your wallet even more. And when it comes to the New River and Salton Sea, these are long emergencies that I don't have any patience for and want to get them taken care of. And I'd ask for your vote on by November 3rd, I should say.
Thank you, Mr. Hamby. Mr. Childers, your closing statement, 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to say that I have made clear throughout this campaign that I will not support any further water transfers. So on that, Mr. Hamby and I agree. Our water is necessary for us to maintain our way of life, and we cannot allow any more water to leave this valley. But that does not mean that we have to shut ourselves off and can't interact and listen to other communities around us, other water users on the Colorado River. And this idea of this 2/3 vote, it sounds wonderful. But I too trust the people. I trust the people deeply, and I trust the people to elect IID board members who are going to be spending, as the question posed, 60 hours a week immersing themselves in becoming experts on these issues that the public has elected them to do. Unlike Mr. Hamby, I am not afraid, as he said earlier, to have the pressure of making votes that will have the future of the valley hang in the balance. That is exactly what IID board directors are elected to do. But I do not think it is wise to open our water up to manipulation by outside sources with large amounts of money to try and campaign and distort the issue. nor do I believe it is wise to weaken the IID board and the IID as a whole, as was suggested by Mr. Abadi 3 or 4 times in his most recent op-ed. And so I will not support that. I will support electing IID directors who will not transfer more water. And it's as simple as that. When it comes to power rates, I've said over and over again, my values are to keep rates low and affordable. But I believe it is a mistake to say that we cannot allow economic development to flourish in our community unless we raise power rates. I've shown in the budget that's not true and that's not correct. We can have and do both, and I am committed to that. So on November 3rd, or when you get your mail-in ballot, please vote for Experience. Vote Childers for the IID Board of Directors. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Childers. Gentlemen and our people in the audience, I want to thank the candidates and the audience for their participation. We encourage all citizens of Imperial Valley to vote either by the soon-to-be sent mail-in ballots or at the polls on November 3rd, 2020. Our next forum will be October 8th, 2020 for IID Division 4. Thanks for joining us this evening, and good night.
You've been listening to the Imperial Irrigation District Division 2 Candidates Forum. Recorded coverage has been a production of Kxo Radio's Public Affairs Department. Coverage is underwritten by Colab of Imperial County and the IV Vegetable Growers Association. For Kxo Radio, this is Jared Anchondo reporting.